Last time we spoke about the Japanese victory over Tran Kufuang. Japanese generals hatched a plan: strike at night, seize the peak, and bargain if need be. Colonel Sto, steady as a compass, chose Nakano's brave 75th Regiment, selecting 5 fearless captains and a rising star, Nakajima, to lead the charge. Ahead, scouts and engineers treaded a fragile path through the darkness, while distant Soviet tanks rumbled like thunder. At 2:15 a.m., wire was breached and soldiers slipped over the slope. The crest resisted with brutal tenacity. Grenades flashed, mountain guns spit fire, and leaders fell. Yet by 5:15 a.m., dawn painted the hill in a pale light. The Japanese hands grasped the summit. The dawn assault on the nearby Hill 52 and on the Xiaoqiaofeng corridor followed, with Takeshita and Matsunobe's units threading through fog, fire, and shifting trenches. Adokawa's howitzers answered the dawn with measured fury, silencing the Soviets' early artillery as Japanese infantry pressed forward. By daybreak, the Russians were driven back, their lines frayed, and they were retreating towards Khasan. The price was steep. Dozens of officers were dead or injured. A crescent smoke, and memory was left etched onto every face. This episode is the Russian Counteroffensive over the Heights. Well, hello again, and welcome back to the Fall and Rise of China podcast. I'm your dutiful host, Greg Watson. But before we begin, I just want to remind you all that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to learn a bit more about the history of Asia? Kings and Generals has an assortment of episodes on the history of Asia, and so much more, so go give them a look over at YouTube. So please subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube, and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcasts over at the Pacific War and Eastern Front week-by-week podcasts, both written and narrated by me. And if after all that you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel, found over at YouTube, and my podcast series, Echoes of War, found on major podcast platforms. Over on Echoes of War, we just began another mini-series covering the Battle of the Atlantic. And if you're looking to support me further, please consider checking out my YouTube membership or my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. By joining either of these, you get access to the exclusive podcast series, which is 30 episodes and ongoing at this point, early access to all the content I make, and voting rights for subjects I will tackle next. And over there, the latest exclusive podcast is about the disastrous attack on Sydney Harbor in World War II. So if that's of interest to you, please go check it out. After admitting the loss of Tran Kufuang, Xiaoqiaofeng, by the dawn of the 31st of July, the Russian government issued a communiqué the next day asserting that Soviet troops had, quote, hurled back a Japanese division after a 2-day battle. Said battle involved tanks, artillery, and aircraft. Some hours after the Japanese penetration, Soviet regulars rushed to the scene and drove out the invaders. Japanese losses amounted to 400 men. Soviet losses were 13 killed and 55 wounded. On Soviet soil, the Japanese abandoned 5 cannons, 14 machine guns, and 157 rifles, while the Russians admitted to losing just a tank and a gun. A Soviet reconnaissance pilot may have fallen into Japanese hands after bailing out. Both before and during the Japanese attack, Soviet troops did not once cross the Manchukuoan frontier, which deprived them of the possibility of surrounding or outflanking the invaders. In reality, by August the 1st, Russian ground forces were deployed and the Soviet Air Force took action. Soviet aircraft appeared at about 12:30 to do a reconnaissance. Soon thereafter, more than 10 planes were flying in formation, launching strikes against forward units. 8 sorties, light bombers, and some fighters, roughly 120 to about 150 aircraft in flights of 2 or 3 dozen, bombed and strafed. Raids were conducted by as many as 30 planes, though no Soviet losses were reported. The Russians also hit targets on the Korean side of the Tumen. The 75th Regiment judged that the Soviet Air Force sought only to intimidate them. Russian aircrafts dropped several dozen bombs on the Conquest Bridge, but the span was not struck. Damage was limited to the railway, producing an impression of severity that was quite misleading. The lack of air cover troubled the troops most, however. Japanese casualties on the 1st of August were modest, 3 men were wounded in the 75th Infantry, 1 was wounded, and a horse was killed in the 76th. However, the 3 Japanese battalions expended over 15,000 machine gun and 7,000 rifle rounds that day. The appearance of Soviet air power at Tran Kufuang drew anxious international attention. Shanghai reports electrified observers, who anticipated that major Russo-Japanese hostilities would transform the China campaign overnight. Some observers were openly dismayed, foreseeing a prolongation of the mainland war and potential benefits to Soviet interests. Japanese army spokesmen sought to downplay the entire situation. Officers in Peking told the correspondents that the raids, while serious, represented only a face-saving measure. The Red Army was reportedly attempting to compensate for the losses at Tran Kufuang and other disputed positions, but aside from the bombings, the frontier remained quiet. If the Russians were serious, observers noted, they would have bombed the vital Ungi Railway Bridge, which remained untouched. Raids focused on minor bridges with limited damage. In Tokyo, foreign observers believed the appearance of about 50 Soviet heavy bombers over North Korea signaled an extension of the incident, and that the Japanese government was taking urgent measures. Military leaders decided not to escalate but prepare for emergency. The Korean Army headquarters denied Soviet bombings of Harbin in Manchuria, or Nanjing or Chongjin in Korea. Regarding retaliation, an American correspondent reported that the Japanese military had no intention of bombing Russian territory. Although Soviet use of aircraft introduced a new dimension of danger, the main efforts remained ground-based on both sides. After Japanese troops cleared Tran Kufuang and Chaojiaofang, the Russians appeared to be redeploying to contract their defensive frontage. No troops or works remained west of Khasan. 4 or 5 Russian infantry companies and 10 artillery pieces stood between the lake and Paksikori, while the main forces, with numerous gun sites, were concentrated west of Novokivsk. Over on the Kwangtung Army front in southeast Manchuria, no changes were observed. The Russians were completely shocked by their defeat at Tran Kufuang and must suddenly have resorted to negative conservative measures. Korea Army headquarters also assessed the situation on the evening of July 31st as such. The enemy must fear a Japanese advance into the Novokivsk plain, and therefore is concentrating his main forces in the district. Our interests require that we anticipate any emergency, so we must prepare the necessary strength in the Kowgon region and reinforce positions in Wujiaozu. At 8:45 p.m. on the 31st, the 19th Division received a detailed message from the Honchon garrison commander describing his northward deployments. Sutaka was heartened. He remembered, "Earnestly, I desired to bring about the end of the incident as a result of the fighting on the 30th and 31st of July, but was equally resolved to defend the border firmly, based on Japanese interpretation of the Honchon Pact, in case the Soviet side did not perform intensive self-reflection." First, Sutaka issued instructions from Konggun at about 8:15 a.m. on the 31st via Seto. "It is our intention that Tran Kufuang and the high ground northwest of Xiaoqiaofang be secured, as well as the high ground south of Xiaoqiaofang, if possible. Enemy attacks are to be met at our positions, but you are not to pursue far." Secondly, Colonel Tanaka was instructed not to fire as long as Russian artillery did not bombard friendly forces. "Except for preparing against counter-assaults, your actions will be cautious, in particular harassing fire against inhabited places and residences prohibited." Sutaka was finally armed with formal authority, received at about 10:05 p.m. on August 1st. He did not delay in implementing it. At about 11 o'clock, he ordered the immediate rail movement of strong reinforcements, the alerted infantry brigade headquarters, as well as 4 infantry battalions and the remaining mountain artillery battalion. Thus, Sutaka could deploy forward not only the forces he had requested, but also a brigade-level organization to assume control of the now sizable combat elements massed at the front for maneuvers. Earlier that afternoon, he had already moved his division's message center forward to the Matsuotsu Heights at the Tumen, and he regularly posted at least 1 staff officer there so that the center could function as the division's combat headquarters. An additional matter of explosive potential was built into the divisional order. Provision of Japanese Air Force coverage for rail movements forward, although the use of aircraft had been prohibited by all higher headquarters. Nakimura intended only for ground cover. At the front, Japanese units spent most of their time consolidating their hard-won positions. By 3 a.m. on August 1st, a column of Soviet forces with vehicles were observed moving from the eastern side of Lake Khasan. Late in the day, the division received an extremely important telegram from the 2nd Intelligence Section of the Kwangtung Army. According to a special espionage report from our OSS in the Khabarovsk city, Red Army authorities there have decided to retake the high ground along Tran Kufuang. From other intelligence, the Kwangtung Army concluded that the Russians were rebuilding in the Novokivsk region. Frequent movements observed immediately to the rear of the Soviet battle zone caused Sato to grow apprehensive about a dawn counterattack on the 1st, and he reinforced Tran Kufuang with the 6th Company. The 2nd of August was marked by a continuation of Soviet air attacks and the anticipated Russian counteroffensive. According to Japanese intelligence, Marshal Bryuker had arrived in Khabarovsk and Lieutenant General Sokolov was in Voroshilov. A defensive buildup estimated at about 3,000 men plus tanks and guns were reported in the Kozando area by the evening of the 1st. Hirahara, commanding the battalion at Tran Kufuang, grew concerned about Hill 52. With the day's end approaching, he reinforced the defenses further, and he ordered the battalion medical officer to establish a dressing station at Fangchongting. At around 3 p.m., Soviet artillery began firing forward areas, especially gun positions. The bombardments were described as quite severe. Japanese artillery sought to conserve ammunition, firing only at worthwhile short-range targets. Main Russian ground actions focused on the far right against Hill 52 and the far left against Xiaoqiaofeng, not Tran Kufuang itself. In line with Hirahara's orders, 2 infantry companies and 4 heavy machine guns were moved by about 8 a.m. from Tran Kufuang to the heights 800 meters southeast. Soviet heavy artillery pounded the zone between Fangchongting and Hill 52, observing the enemy becoming difficult. Russian planes engaged at 9 a.m. with some fighters and then bombers to soften defenses and gun positions. Meanwhile, the Soviets deployed firepower southeast of Lake Khasan, with 2 infantry battalions and more than 10 tanks advancing through the pines on the western slopes. Japanese regimental guns and 2 machine gun platoons at Hill 52 attacked the enemy heavy machine guns and neutralized them. By 10 a.m., the Russians had advanced with heavy weapons to some high ground 800 meters from Hill 52. From Tran Kufuang, the battalion guns engaged heavy weapons. Hirahara moved with the engineers and battalion guns to the heights to which he transferred reinforcements earlier, took command, and prepared for an assault. Initially, Soviet troops advanced in formation, but after cresting a dip, they dispersed and moved on to some high ground opposite Hill 52. Heavily armed, they drew within 700 meters with artillery and heavy machine guns providing coverage. By 10 a.m., Sato requested Shiozawa's mountain guns across the Tumen to unleash a barrage against Hill 52's front. For about half an hour, the battery fired. By 10:30, the Soviet advance grew listless. Believing the moment was ripe, Hirahara deployed his men to charge the foe's right wing, ordering rapid movement with caution against the eastern flank fire. On the heights north of Hill 52, Inagaki watched the struggle, with his telephone out, and the situation looked quite urgent. He brought up firepower on his own initiative. Taking the main body of the 1st Machine Gun Company, along with the battalion guns, he moved out at noon, making contact with the 10th Company on Hill 52 at around 2 p.m., where the Japanese machine guns and battalion guns joined the fray. The Russians, losing momentum, were checked by Japanese heavy weapons and by mountain guns coming from Hill 82. Hirahara's main battalion advanced onto the high ground north of Hill 52 around noon. By about 3 p.m., 2 enemy companies began to fall back, climbing the western slopes of Hill 29, as the main forces retreated in piecemeal. By 4 p.m., Sutaka observed that his units were continuing to secure their positions and were, quote, gradually breaking the hostile intention. Despite the heat and rain, frontline troops showed fatigue but remained vigilant. Between 11 and 4 p.m., Sato inspected the lines and directed defensive positions, particularly at Hill 52. After a poor initial performance, the Russians awaited reinforcements before attempting another assault on Hill 52. They moved up mechanized corps, and by 3 p.m., 50 tanks massed east of Maishan. At around 5 p.m., the Russians began moving south along the high ground across Khasan. Another 2 Soviet battalions advanced along the Tumen Hills, led by armor. It had anticipated an assault at twilight, especially after 6 p.m., when 9 bombers struck Hill 52. Earlier, Takeshita had received reports from the anti-tank commander, Lieutenant Saito, that at 5 p.m. several enemy tanks and 3 infantry battalions were advancing from Hill 29. Convinced of an imminent Soviet strike, Takeshita ordered the defense to conceal its efforts and to annihilate the foe with point-blank fire and hand-to-hand combat. He sought to instill confidence that hostile infantry could not reach the positions. Before 7 p.m., the enemy battalions came within effective range, and the Japanese opened with all available firepower. Rapid-fire anti-tank guns set the lead tank alight. The remaining tanks were stopped. Support came from Hisatune's regimental guns and 2 anti-tank gun squads atop Tran Kufuang. The Russian advance was completely checked. By nightfall, Soviet elements had displaced heavy weapons about 400 meters from the Japanese positions. As early as 4 p.m., Suetaka ordered a mountain artillery squad to cross the river. Saito told Takeshita at 7:30 that there would be a night attack against Hill 52. Takeshita was to annihilate the foe after allowing them to close in to 40 to 50 meters. The Russians did mount a night assault, and they pressed close between 8 and 9 p.m., with 3 battalions led by 4 tanks. The main force targeted Takeshita. All 10 Russian heavy machine guns engaged that side. Japanese machine guns and battalion guns joined the fray. The Russians pressed within 30 meters, shouting, "Hurrah! Hurrah!" They hurled grenades before advancing a further 15 meters. The Japanese repelled the first waves with grenades and emplaced weapons, leaving light machine guns and grenade dischargers forward. Soviet illuminating shells were fired to enable closer approaches within 100 meters. Japanese grenade discharger fire blasted the forces massed in the dead space before the works. While the Hill 52 night attack collapsed, other Russian units, smaller in strength and with 1 tank leading, moved against the hill on the left, which the Japanese had not yet occupied that morning. The Russians advanced along the Khasan slope north of Hill 52, came within point-blank range, and shouted but did not charge. By 10 p.m., the Japanese, supported by machine guns, had checked the foe. Thereupon, the 6th Company, now under a platoon leader, Narusawa, launched a counterattack along the lake. The enemy was bewildered and became dislocated. Buddies were heard shouting to one another, and some could be seen hauling away their dead comrades. The Soviet troops held back 300 to 400 meters and began to dig in. Saito decided artillery should sweep the zone in front of Hill 52. At 9:30 p.m., he requested support, but the mountain guns could not open fire. Still, by 11 p.m., not a shadow of an enemy soldier remained on Hill 52's front, where the Japanese spent the night on full alert. Over in the northern sector, 8 Russian tanks crossed the Japanese-claimed border at about 5:25 p.m. on the 2nd of August, and they moved south to a position northwest of Xiaoqiaofeng. Around 7 Russian artillery pieces opened fire to prepare the Japanese, while a dozen heavy bombers attacked. An hour later, the ground offensive began in earnest, with 1.5 to 2 infantry battalions, a dozen machine guns, and several tanks. Supporting Takanouchi's left wing were several batteries of main artillery, alongside 2 mountain guns. Well-planned counterfire stopped the offensive. There was little change north of Xiaoqiaofeng, and in the southeast, where Kanda's company held its position against the attack. On Takanouchi's front, Aokishizawa noted about 120-degree daytime heat and nighttime chill. Men endured damp clothes and mosquitoes. To keep warm at night, soldiers moved about. During the day, they sought shade and camouflage with twigs and weeds. No defense existed against the cold night rain, however. Nocturnal vigilance required napping by day when possible, but the intense sun drained away all the strength from the men. For 3 days, Imagawa's company had only wild berries and some dirty river water to eat. At 6 p.m. on August 2nd, Colonel Tanaka exhorted his artillery to, quote, "Exalt maximum annihilation power at close range. Engage confirmed targets and display firepower that is sniper-like, precise, concentrated, and as swift as a hurricane." Tanaka devised interdiction sectors for day and night attacks. At 10:30 a.m., the artillery laid down severe fire and eventually caused the enemy assault to wither. At around 12:40 a.m., Rokutana's battalion detected a Russian battalion of towed artillery moving into position at the skirt of Manchan. When the first shells hit near the vanguard, a commander on horseback fled. The rest dispersed, abandoning at least 8 artillery wagons and 10 vehicles. Suetaka, observing from the Kochung BGU, picked up the phone and he commended the 3rd Battalion. Japanese casualties on August 2nd were relatively light. 10 men killed, 15 wounded. Amongst the killed, the 75th Infantry lost 7, the 76th lost 2, and the engineers lost 1. Among the wounded, the 75th suffered 9 and the 76th 6. Infantry ammunition was expended at an even higher rate than on the 30th of July. In Hiraha's battalion area, small arms, machine guns, ammunition, helmets, knapsacks, and gas masks were all captured. A considerable portion of seized material was employed in subsequent combat, as in the case of anti-tank guns and ammunition captured on the 31st of July. Soviet casualties to date were estimated about 200 to 250, including 70 abandoned corpses. 12 enemy tanks had been captured, and 5 were knocked out. Several dozen heavy bombers and about 5,000 Soviet ground troops were involved in this concerted offensive. Nevertheless, reports of imminent Soviet night attacks against Hill 52 on August the 2nd to 3rd alarmed Tsuutaka as much as his subordinates. Shortly after 10 p.m., accompanied by his intelligence officer, Tsuutaka set out for the hill, resolved to direct operations himself. Somewhat earlier, the division had sent Korea Army Headquarters a message, received at about 6:30 p.m., reflecting Tsuutaka's current outlook. 30 to 40 Soviet planes had been bombing all sectors since the morning, but losses were negligible and morale remained high. The division had brought up additional elements in accordance with the Army orders and was continuing to strive for non-enlargement, but was, quote, prepared firmly to reject the enemy's large-scale attacks. Impressed by the severity of the artillery and small arms fire, Tsuutaka deemed it imperative to, quote, quickly to met out a decisive counterassault and thus hasten the solution of this incident. But Japanese lines were thinly held and counterattacks required fresh strength. This state of affairs caused Tsuutaka to consider imminent commitment of reinforcements moving to the front, although the Korea Army had insisted on prior permission before additional troops might cross the Tumen. Tsuutaka's customary and unsurprising solution was again to rely on his own initiative and authorize commitment of every reinforcement unit. Nearest was Sato's 73rd Regiment, which had been ordered that night before to move up from Nanam. Under the cover of 2 Japanese fighters, these troops had alighted from the train the next morning at Tsukaku, where they awaited orders eagerly. Sato was receiving reports about the enemy buildup. At 8:20, orders were given to the 73rd Regiment to proceed at once to Matsuotsu's crossing and be prepared to support the 75th. Involved were Sato's 2 battalions, about half of the total infantry reinforcements. Tsuutaka had something else in mind, his trump card, Okido 76 Infantry. At 11:40, he ordered this regiment, coming up behind the 73rd, to proceed to Huichongyuan on the Manchurian side of the Tumen via Kongun, to intercept the enemy and be ready to go on the offensive. On the basis of this information, the division planned to employ Okido's regiment for an enveloping attack. Sato quickly worked out the details. He would conceal the presence of the reinforcements expected momentarily from the 73rd Regiment, and then he would move Senda's BGU and Shimabuno's battalion to Huichongyuan to cover the advance of the 76th Regiment and then come under the latter's control. Japanese forces faced the danger of Soviet actions against Tran Kufuang from the Xiaoqiaofeng front after midnight on the 2nd of August. Takanochi had been ready to strike when he learned that the enemy had launched an attack at about 1 a.m. against one of his own companies, Matsunobu's southwest position on Xiaoqiaofeng. Therefore, Takanochi's main unit were to drive off the attackers, return to their positions by about 2:30 a.m. The Russians tried again, starting at about 4 a.m. on the 3rd of August. Strong elements came as close as 300 meters. Near 5 a.m., Soviet artillery and heavy weapons fire had grown quite hot, and 9 enemy fighters made ineffective strafing passes. By 6:30 a.m., the Russians seemed thwarted completely, however. Hill 52 was pummeled during the 3 battles on August 2nd. Taking advantage of night, the Russians had been regrouping east of the hill. Heavy machine guns were set up on the ridge lines about 500 meters away. From 5 a.m. on August 3rd, the Russians opened up with heavy weapons. Led by 3 tanks, 50 to 60 infantrymen had attacked from the direction of Hill 29, and they reached a line about 700 meters from the Japanese defenses. Here the Russian soldiers peppered away, but one of their tanks was set ablaze by gunfire. The other 2 were damaged, and they had to flee up into a dip. Kamemori's mountain artillery reinforcements reached Nampozan by 7:15 a.m. on August 3rd. Tanaka issued an order directing the battalion to check the zone east of Hill 52, as well as to engage artillery across Lake Khasan. A site for the supply unit was to be selected beyond enemy artillery range, and on that day before, the Russian shells had hit the supply unit of the 3rd Mountain Artillery Battalion, killing 2 men and 20 horses. The exposed force was ordered to take cover behind a crest line 1,000 meters to the rear. After 9 a.m. on August 3rd, the artillery went to action again, and Japanese morale was enhanced. At around that same time, Soviet bombardments grew pronounced, accompanied by bomber strikes. The Japanese frontline infantry responded with intensive fire, supported by mountain pieces and regimental guns atop Tran Kufuang. Enemy forces stayed behind their heavy weapons and they moved no further, while their casualties mounted. At 11 a.m., the Russians began to fall back, leaving only machine guns and snipers. One reason the Soviets had been frustrated since the early morning was that Seto had seen the urgency of closing the gap midway between Tran Kufuang and Hill 52, a site that they called the Scattered Pines. He had shifted the 2nd Company from Tran Kufuang. Between 6 and 7:40 a.m., the company fired on Soviet troops which had advanced north of Hill 52 and inflicted considerable casualties. A corporal commanding a grenade launcher was cited posthumously for leading an assault which caused the destruction of 3 heavy machine guns. In the afternoon, the Japanese sustained 2 shellings and a bomber raid. Otherwise, the battlefield was quiet, since Russian troops had pulled back towards Hill 29 by 3 p.m. under the cover of heavy weapons and artillery. At Hill 52, however, defense posed a problem, for each barrage smashed positions and trenches. During intervals between bombardments and airstrikes, the men struggled to repair and reinforce the facilities. Tran Kufuang was again not attacked by ground troops during the day, but was hit by planes and artillery. Trifling support was rendered by the mountain guns, which had been moved to the Manchurian side of the Tumen. Japanese infantry reinforcements were on the way. By 11 p.m. on August 2nd, Seto had left Shikai. His 73rd Regiment pushed forward along some roads, so sodden that the units had to dismantle the heavy weapons for hauling. The rate of the advance was little more than a kilometer per hour, but finally at 5:20 a.m. on August 3rd, he had reached the Tran Kufuang area with the bulk of the 2 battalions. L'Esprit du Corps, the other frontline troops, had soared. Seto was commanding all forces across the Tumen pending Morimoto setting up his headquarters for the 37th Brigade. Seto then took the line to the left of Tran Kufuang, employing Takenouchi's old unit and the 73rd Regiment to cover Xiaoqiaofang. Seto set up his battalions at 6 a.m. amid some heavy rain. By 7:30, under severe fire, he was in a position to command the new left sector. According to divisional orders to Morimoto, this zone was to include the heights south and northwest of Xiaoqiaofang, but in the case of the former, it was, quote, permissible to pull back and occupy some high ground west of the heights and south of Xiaoqiaofang. Seto contemplated using his regiment to encircle the foe on the north side of the lake, while Okito's 76th Infantry formed the other prong. Most of the day afterwards, Soviet artillery was active. The Japanese responded with barrages of their own. Eventually, from 3:30 p.m., the entire enemy frontline forces in the sector began falling back under violent covering fire. Morimoto's initial operational orders received at 6 p.m. advised Seto officially that he was coming under the command of the 37th Brigade. The night of the 3rd of August passed with the units uneasily, striving to conduct security reconnaissance while working on battered defenses. Total Japanese casualties on August 3rd were light again, 6 men killed and 10 wounded, 4 of the dead and 7 of the wounded being suffered by the 75th Infantry, the rest by Takenouchi's battalion. Ammunition was expended at a lower rate than on the preceding days. The Japanese War Ministry reported no significant change since the nightfall of the 3rd. Thereafter, the battlefield seemed to return to a lull. Japanese morale was quite high. In the press abroad, Tran Kufuang attracted some overriding attention. The world was no longer talking of border affrays. 3 column headlines on the first page of the New York Times announced, Soviet hurls 6 divisions and 30 tanks into battle with the Japanese on border. The 2 claim conflict. Tokyo reports victory in Manchukuo and the foe's big losses. Moscow asserts it has won. The startling claim that 6 Soviet divisions were in action seemed to have been supplied for external consumption by Shinking as well as Seoul. According to Nakamura, the Russians employed 4,000 to 5,000 men, supported by 230 tanks. Although Japanese casualties were moderate, Soviet artillery bombardment had stripped the hills of their lush summer grass. According to the uninformed foreign press, the meager information showed both sides were heavily armed with the most modern equipment. The Russians were using small, fast tanks, and the Japanese apparently were forewarned of this type of weapon, and they were well supplied with batteries of armor-piercing anti-tank guns. On the 3rd of August, the Russians had lost about 200 men, 15 tanks, and 25 light artillery pieces. One feature of the fighting was the Japanese use of thousands of flares to expose fog-shrouded enemy ranks during the Soviet night attacks. During the first phase counteroffensive by the Russians, the 75th Regiment judged that the enemy's choice of opportunities for attacking was senseless. Once they started, they continued until an annihilating blow was dealt. We did not observe truly severe attacking capacity, such as lightning breakthroughs. With respect to tactical methods, the Japanese noted that Soviet offensive deployment was characterized by depth, which facilitated piecemeal destruction. When Russian advance elements suffered losses, replacements were moved up gradually. Soviet artillery fired without linkage to the frontline troops. Nor was there liaison between the ground attacks staged in the Xiaoqiaofeng sector and the Hill 52 sector. Since enemy troops fought entirely on their own, they could be driven off in one swoop. Additionally, although 20 to 30 Russian tanks appeared during the counterattacks, their cooperation with the infantry was clumsy, and the armor was stopped. Soviet use of artillery in mobile warfare was deemed poor. Our troops never felt the least concern about hostile artillery forces, which were quite numerous. Even privates scoffed at the incapability of the Russian artillery. It seemed that the enemies had lost their fighting spirit. They had a habit of fleeing far. During the combat from July the 31st to August the 3rd, the defeated Russians appeared to fear pursuit and dashed all the way back to Khasan, although we did not advance even a step beyond the boundary. On August the 4th, Tsutoka prepared a secret evaluation. The enemy attacks by day and night on August the 2nd were conducted by frontline corps built around the 40th Rifle Division. In view of the failure of these assaults, the foe was bound to carry out a more purposeful offensive effort using newly arrived corps reinforcements. Russian actions on the 2nd of August had been the most serious and persistent offensive efforts undertaken since the outset of the incident, but they were about the last by the frontline corps whose immediate jurisdiction lay in the region of the incident. Consequently, the enemy's loss of morale as a result of their defeats, combined with their lack of unity and attack power, caused the attacks to end in failure. We must be prepared for the fact that the enemy forces will now mount a unified and deliberate offensive, avoiding rash attacks in view of their previous reversals, since large new corps are now coming up. I'd like to take this time to remind all of you that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Please go subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube. You can also produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcasts over at the Pacific War and Eastern Front Week by Week podcast, both written and narrated by me. If after all that, you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, Pacific War channel, found over at YouTube, or my podcast series, Echoes of War, found on major podcast platforms. If you're looking to further support me, please consider checking out my YouTube membership or my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. By joining either of these, you get access to the exclusive podcast series, early access to all the content I make, and voting rights to the subjects I will tackle next. Within the Shadowed Night, Sato chose Nakano's 75th to seize a peak, sending 5 captains and a rising Nakajima into the darkness. 2:15 a.m., they breached the wires, they climbed the slopes, and by dawn, they had won the crest. Then Hill 52 and Xiaoqiaofeng yielded to resolve and fire. The day wore on with brutal artillery, fluttering bombers, and relentless clashes. By August's edge, casualties were mounting on both sides, yet the Japanese regiments held fast, repelling night's assaults with grit